Hello.
Hello.
Mark Hilderbrand?
Joe, how are you?
I'm all right, brother. You're live on Vintage Motocross Radio.
All right, wonderful.
Did you get a chance to listen to what Brock Glover had to say just a moment ago?
Yeah, I was excited.
Isn't it?
I think next year me and you have to be in it.
Oh, I could only hope, Mark. You know, I could only hope that you and I would get invited to do something like that. And well, we don't know where the location is, but who knows? Maybe it'll be someplace nice and warm, and we all could make it next year, and it would be a really great time. So
it's all fun and games until the compound fracture.
Yeah, that's it. Until the ambulance, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Mark. You know, you're well known in the industry for making the world's finest Kawasaki plastic. I wouldn't use anything else on my restorations, and you have one of the most impressive Kawasaki SR factory bike collections in the world. But a kid from St. Louis had to get started somewhere, so why don't we go back a bit? And you know, I think I know where I want to go back a bit too. Because what happened first for you, Mark? Did you have a little Kawasaki G31, or were you a BMX kid first? Where did it all begin?
So I actually started racing motorcycles before I started racing BMX.
Okay.
So when I was a kid, my cousin worked at a Kawasaki shop. And so I could get all Kawasaki stuff for dealer cost plus 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And my cousin that worked there was kind of the golden child of the family. And so anything that he did, I did. And my parents would let me do it.
Because he was doing it?
Yeah, and as soon as Cliff got a motorcycle, well then I got a motorcycle too. And he was like my big brother, and he took me to all the races and did everything for me. And so, so that's how it all started. And my first race bike was an MC1 M90. We got it in the fall of 1973. It was actually a 74 model, but you know how they come out a little bit early. And
I do.
I got it in, I believe, September. I remember I was at school in September, and my first race was in November.
How'd that go for you?
So I was 9 years old, and I was scared unbelievable, but it was pretty great. We actually, the track that I raced at was actually St. Peter's Cycle World USA, which was a nationally known track.
Oh, sure.
They had all the vintage, or all the Trans Am races and all the 125, 250, 500 races there. And it was really great. It was great.
How many years did you do that for?
So I raced up until the mid-'80s, and then kind of realized that I needed to get a real job, and so I became a sales rep in the bicycle business, and I did that for about 12 or 13 years, and then I became a sales rep in the motorcycle business.
Okay, now let's back up a bit. How soon after, or you raced your Kawasaki for, it sounds like 7 years, and then you went into BMX?
Yeah, I went into BMX probably about 1980, I would say.
Okay, and how far did you go with that? Did you just go like up to the expert level? Because I think I've seen some pictures on your Facebook page with some BMX legends like Tim Judge and a few other guys.
Yeah. Tim for a while actually lived in St. Louis, and we became really good friends. And I actually raced. I got up to B Pro class.
Okay.
Which was kind of the beginner pro class, if that makes any sense.
It does.
And I never really made a lot of money at it, but I made enough money to get to the next city and go to a race and pay for the hotel and pay for all the travel and stuff. But
so
it was great.
So you were driving yourself in a little pickup truck to all these BMX races?
Yep, little Datsun pickup truck.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a blast.
It certainly sounds like it. Now,
so
go ahead.
When I was a kid, my dad hated me racing motorcycles.
Sure.
But my mom loved it, and she took me to all the races. She had an old Delta 88 Oldsmobile, and we had some bumper hitch racks on the back that we put my little 90 on the back, and some tie downs that we hooked to the trunk of the car, and she'd take me to the races. every Sunday or every other Sunday.
Wow.
Oh, it was great.
So after the mini bike days and the BMX days, you become a sales rep for some of these bigger companies, and you're out there on the road. Who'd you work for, and where did that part of your life take you?
So when I first became a rep, I became a rep for GT Bicycles. Mm-hmm. And that was right when the freestyle BMX and mountain bike craze came in. Mountain bikes were just in their infancy at that time. Mm-hmm. And I got to ride the whole wave, and GT grew throughout that whole time too, and became a giant in the industry. Mm-hmm. And so I was really fortunate to work for them. Then after I got done with that, I became an independent rep and started working for just as a contractor and working for companies that can't afford a full-time employee, and they just pay me full commission. And I worked for Fox for a while, Fox Racing, and I worked for Troy Lee for a while. I've worked for quite a few different companies. And
now that green Kawasaki blood that you have, you've had it since you're 9 years old.
Yeah.
Let's start to talk a little bit about, well, I don't know whether we should begin talking about how you got involved in the fender business or how you began to amass that amazing works bike collection. Let's start with the fenders. When did you see a need for Kawasaki fenders, and what was the first mold that you made?
So let's start with how it all got started.
Yeah, let's do that.
When I was a kid in 1978, Kawasaki had limited edition bikes. Mm-hmm. They had the 78 A4, 125, and 250s. And I wanted one so bad. I mean, I wanted one so bad. But you had to be an expert or pro-level rider, and not every shop got them.
Yeah.
And I didn't get one. And I actually, to be honest with you, at that time, my parents, they didn't get one for me. They weren't going to get me one anyway. I was still racing schoolboy class in the mini class at that time.
Okay.
And so years go by, just like all of us, and I always wanted a 78 KX125. And I found one, this is before the internet, but I found one in the ARMA book. You remember how they used to have the classifieds in the back?
Sure, I do.
So I found one for sale from a guy named Gil Arnez. And I called Gil up and I said, man, I really want this bike. And he's like, okay, I'll sell it to you for $350.
Wow.
And he goes, but I'm telling you, you're not going to be able to get the plastic for it. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking in the back of my head, I go to 150 shops in Missouri, Kansas, and Illinois every month.
Yeah.
I'll get up in the rafters. I'll find the plastic. That won't be a problem. And so then I got it. And as I was trying to reassemble it or restore it or whatever, I really realized that the plastic was impossible to get. And if you did find it, it would turn army black as it got old, and it looked terrible. And so, so the first kit that I had made was the 78 kit, obviously. And I had to pay for all the molds, and I had to buy a production run of 20 pieces each. And
that had to be a little costly.
It was very costly, and every night when I went to bed, I said my prayers, hoping that I'd sell the other 19 sets, because I only needed one set.
Yeah, and you figured it was going to be over after that.
Well, I didn't even really see it yet, but then all of a sudden, it was kind of right around the internet time, and so I started putting it out, and word kind of spread pretty quickly that I had that stuff, and I sold all 19 kits in less than a month. And I was like, maybe I have something here.
Yeah.
So I bought another round of them, and they sold out just as quick. And then I built the 79 kit, and then I just took the money that I made from the sales of those and built it. And now I own over about 45 or 47 different molds now for 73 to about 86, 87 models. I can do a complete kit for any of them now.
Now, so how many shipments would you say you get out a month? Because I mean, you're not only, it's not that you're the only game in town. Other people make fenders, but nobody has the quality that you have. Nobody has the finish and the fit. There's nothing that even comes close. So
it's really the plastic. The company I work for actually did their homework and realized that to make the thing fit, you couldn't just vacuum form a piece of plastic over an original fender, because then that makes the reproduction fender, it makes it larger than the actual piece.
Right.
And so they figured out how to build a mold and then shrink it, so when you vacuum form the mold, it's actually really close to the stock size. I mean, my fenders are within 40 thousandths of an original fender.
Yes, I know they are, Mark, because I'll tell you what, I've used your plastic, and when I go to drill it, I'll use the old, I'll measure the old fender. Where's the hole compared to the end of the fender?
Sure.
How far is it from the top and whatnot? And as I mean, I didn't know it was 40 thousandths, but going by eye, it's spot on anytime I've ever used it, that's for sure.
It's very close. Yeah, it's very, very close. Now, there's some things that we have to do when it's vacuum formed to make it, because when it's vacuum formed, the plastic's sucked down over the mold.
Yeah.
And so when there's deep recesses or holes everywhere, you can't have the plastic sucked in too far, because then you can't pull the plastic off the mold. And so some of the deep wells in some of the parts are a little bit more shallow with my part, but you can make that up with a spacer or whatever.
Yeah. Now,
and
how many different models for the KXs do you make plastic for? Or maybe I should ask you what years. Yeah, tell me.
So I do every year I do 73 to 86, 87.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I don't do anything after 87 really is because you can buy it from UFO. UFO Plastic makes 87 on vintage stuff. And so there's no sense in me competing against somebody for the plastic if they can make it. And theirs is actually injection molded. And it's about a third of the price of my stuff. I mean, my stuff is real expensive to make. The plastic is real expensive, and then the molds obviously are real expensive. And so I can't even compete with like UFO and the Chirby's when it gets up in the late 80s stuff, price wise anyway.
Right. I've been speaking, a lot to Paul Stannard from Preston Petty. And he's been a great guy. He is. He really is. I'm going to have him on the show in the coming weeks. And I've learned a lot about this whole, making molds and what it costs and thicknesses and all sorts of different things that the average guy may not take into consideration when he goes out there to buy a piece of plastic. You guys really put your neck out there because you have to make a bunch of them. You can't just make 2 fenders and hope you sell them. And
right. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm certain that the Nightmare Racing headquarters is just stacked to the rafters with green plastic like that.
It is, and I try and have everything for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, like when a guy calls up and wants an 85 KX 125 plastic set, I have to have it in stock. Because one, I may lose the customer if I don't have everything, and two, I know what it's like when you're restoring a bike. When you want it, you want it.
That's right.
So I try and keep everything in stock. And when my numbers get down to about 5 in stock, I try and reorder them. And so it's like a treadmill. You're running on it all the time and trying to keep up with it. And I run out of stuff every once in a while, but very seldom. I usually have just about, I'd say 99% of my stuff all the time.
Yeah. Now, do you have a big calling in Europe for your plastic too? You got a lot of customers over there?
Yeah, I do. It's funny because my customers from Australia, I advertise in VMX magazine over there.
Yeah.
And every time they email me or call me, they're like, I'm one of the only guys that have a Kawasaki over here in Australia. They're super rare. There's none. There's hardly any Kawasaki's over here, and I'm probably the only one. And I'm laughing in the back of my head. I'm laughing because I send more things to Australia than any other country.
Yeah, and everybody thinks they have one or there's
everybody thinks they have the only set. Yeah.
So
pretty cool.
So the plastic business got into play, and you were into vintage motocross with the '78 bike, and or did you race there for a while, or how did that go? Did you ever race that '78?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So I never raced that '78 125 because I got real busy making products for everybody, and I took that bike to Mid-Ohio, and somebody had to have it and started just adding zeros to what the number was. That I was like, I don't want to sell it, it's mine, I just want to keep it. And they're like, well, I'll give you this for it, and I'll give you this. Finally, you can only say no so many times.
Right.
And so I took the money and actually sold that bike, and then I took the money from selling that bike and bought more molds and kind of helped grow my company some more. So when I did start racing, I was racing a KX 400, 75 KX 400.
Now, you have an extensive works bike collection, and I know personally, I've seen it. I know you've got a bike that was raced by Steve Wise, one by Ken Howerton, one by maybe even a couple by Jimmy Weinert. How did you crack that glass ceiling, so to speak, and get into the works bike circle? Because that's a real tough club to get into. What was your first bike?
It is. So my first bike was a 75 KX 250, and it came from Gary Semix. And Gary told me that he thinks it's actually Jimmy Weinert's bike, but Jimmy Weinert was on Yamaha in 1975, so it couldn't have been his bike. Right. And so the way that Gary got it is the team used to crisscross across the country, and they had a couple people's houses that they would keep bikes in because the road race team and the motocross team ran out of the same van. And so Gary would have some road race factory bikes sitting in his garage for a while when the motocross team was going out. Okay. And then they'd drop off the motocross bikes and pick up the road race bikes. And so that bike actually got left at Gary's house for years and years and years. And then he sold it to a guy at Mid-Ohio. And that guy restored it. And then he went through a divorce and had to sell everything and lost everything. And that's how I got the bike. Now,
Mark, you said it was a KX. Is it a KX or is it an SR?
It's an SR. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
It's an SR. Yeah, it's an SR 250.
And so that was the first bike the first works bike that you got. And what year did you get that in?
I'm going to say it was 2002.
Oh, okay.
2003, something like that.
Yeah.
And then once I got that bike, I started getting emails and started getting phone calls from people that I'd never met before in the Kawasaki world. And they're like, I know where this bike is, and I know where, the forks to this bike are. And so then I started, kind of opened up a whole new world for me. And then I met a couple guys that had some bikes, and I just started collecting them.
I see. Now, you've got a bike there that was ridden by Steve Wise and Mickey Kessler one year, that number 14 125. Yep. So yep. I know certain bikes you can. I guess my question is, and probably everyone's question who's listening or follows you on Facebook or social media, is how hard is it and how accurate do you think you are when it comes to knowing whose bike it was?
So with that bike, actually, the number 14 bike, Kawasaki only brought two of them over. They only brought two of them over for Steve and it was for Steve originally, and then Steve hated the bike because it was slow. Mm-hmm. And so he quit, and then they put Mickey Kessler on it. And I had a guy that works for Kawasaki, a friend of mine, he's a friend of yours too, Patrick, called me up, and he goes, that's the only SR 125 in the world. He goes, I know because I cut up the other one in the crusher at Kawasaki because that was his job.
Yes. Patrick,
his job was chopping up the works bikes.
Patrick Johnson, sure. And it was his brother Steve, of course, who was factory mechanic for so many great racers, including Brad Lackey. I think he was Weinert's mechanic there for a while, too.
Yeah, quite a few years, yeah, for sure.
So after the SR, what do you trip across next?
So then the next one I got was there's a collector over in Australia, and he contacted me, and he was just trying to thin his herd. He's got more SRs than I do, and he's kind of more into the 80s single shock radiator type bikes.
Yes.
And I'm into the more 70s bikes because that was kind of, in 76 I went to the Trans Am, and after the race you could go into the pits. And in 76 I was 11 years old. And that's kind of when the little neuron in my head clicked, and I realized that, hey, these bikes that they're racing aren't really the same bikes that you can buy at the shop. And that's when I really realized that they were all handmade, specialty bikes, and then they just kind of look like the bikes that are at the shop.
Right, but they're not that close at all. And and I can relate. I can relate to that because as a kid, I went to Unadilla too, and to Binghamton and to a couple of other places up there, and it was just as exciting to see those bikes as it was to see the guys that were riding them.
Oh yeah, it was. So I'm a firm believer that most of my customers and most of my friends, we all lived through the 70s in motocross.
Oh yeah.
And I really truly believe that was the best time in history to ever live and to witness motocross in that time.
Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, the transition of the long travel suspension, of course, our riders getting better each year. It certainly was the best time in motocross without question. And for you to have some of those bikes and to have that history with you there, it's really, really something special. Now, I'm sorry?
I said it's wonderful. So on those pictures that you're showing,
yes.
So there's one picture there that's got my 76 SR 125, my 14 bike.
Yeah.
And then facing it the other way is a 1980 SR 125, and that really shows the difference and the growth of motocross, because with the 76 SR they only had like 7 or 8 inches of travel and air-cooled engines, and then you go to 1980 and that was actually a water-cooled engine and was single shock, and they had 12 inches of travel. And so just in those 4 years, and then everything in between those 4 years was radically changed weekly.
Oh yeah.
And it just really kind of shows the growth of the end of the 70s with motocross bikes.
Now, one year I remember, I know it was probably one of the most special days of your life. I think it was 2007. I think maybe it was a little before. There was a race there at Mid Ohio, and you supplied your works bikes, several of them, to Gary Semick, Jimmy Weinert. What was it like that day to see your motocross heroes on bikes that you now own?
Well, so the dirty little secret is they were actually production bikes.
Ah, okay.
Nobody rides my works bikes.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Now that you mention it, Mark, my memory's a little foggy too. I just remember I was there that day, and I do remember in one of the pictures here, there's a picture of you and Steve Johnson and Jimmy Weinert next to that one bike. So now that you mention it, I do remember that they were not factory bikes, but you did have your production bikes with these guys on it. So what was that like?
Oh, it was awesome because I became friends with Steve.
Mm-hmm.
And I told Steve about it. He was going to be there, and the bike that we're standing behind there is actually Jeff Ward's 82 SR 125. And Steve actually bought an SR engine from me to put in that bike because he took that home from the factory and was going to take that Works 125 and put a KLX engine in it and make a trail bike out of it.
Oh, boy.
And he carried it around from house to house to house for 30 years. And then one night I got this phone call, and he's like, hey, Mark, this is Steve Johnson from Kawasaki. And I'm like, oh, my God.
Yeah.
It's like talking to Elvis. I'm like, you're my hero.
Uh-huh.
And so I had an engine that he needed, so I sold him the engine with the handshake deal that if he ever wants to sell that bike, that he'll give me first shot at it. And so getting back to that race, so I knew Jimmy Weinert was coming in. I knew Gary Semix was coming, but they didn't know that Steve was coming. And I kind of kept it a secret.
Mm-hmm.
And so we all showed up there at Mid-Ohio, and it was just great because they were as excited to see Steve as I was to see them.
Yeah.
You know, it was really cool.
Yeah, it was like putting the band back together, huh?
Oh, yeah, it was great, yeah. So I remember a phone call, my wife called me, and she's like, well, so how's it going? Because I was a nervous wreck getting those bikes ready and freaking out the whole time beforehand. And I remember saying, man, I'm living the dream.
Yeah.
And it was just like, I couldn't believe it. The whole band was back together, and it was all, you know, it was all together again. It was really cool.
It was, and it's great that we've got some pictures of that, and that we can always cherish that memory. And I think we should talk about it at least once every 6 months, so I can get my story straight and remember exactly what the hell is going on. Now, you've got a Kent Howerton bike too.
Yep.
How did that purchase come about?
So that came from a guy in California, and he got it at a swap meet, and it was just not a motorcycle swap meet. It was, you go to buy hubcaps for your lowrider.
Oh, like a flea market.
Like a flea market, just a Saturday flea market. And he found it there. And he knew it was special because he saw the frame was hand welded or whatever. And that it had some magnesium parts on it and some sand cast parts on it. So he knew it was special, but it was a wreck. It was the top or the down tube of the front of the frame actually had rebar welded to the frame.
Wow.
To hold it together. Because the guy had a green sticker on it and was riding it in the desert for years. And so when I stripped it down and I took it to my welder guy that fixes everything, the thing had 17 cracks in the frame.
Wow.
And we had to repair them all and get them, and we made it look like brand new. And
what season is that bike from? Do you know?
So technically it's an '82.
Yeah.
But Kent raced it in the very first Supercross in '83. And it's a single radiator 250. So the KX 125s from the mid '80s were all single radiator, and so it was basically a single radiator set up like a 125, but it was a 250 engine in it.
Okay.
And then they realized that radiator wasn't big enough to cool the water and stuff, and so they had heating problems, and so then they went to dual radiators.
Now, you've got a Howerton bike. You mentioned that you've got one Jeff Ward bike?
I have one Jeff Ward bike, yeah, the '82. I finally got it from Steve. Okay,
and now what about Weinert? What bikes do you have that Jimmy rode?
So Weinert's bike is my number 17 bike,
mm-hmm.
and that's a '78 SR 125. And that's the one where they had the radically laid down shocks, and Jimmy hated that bike because the shocks were laid down so bad that they didn't work real well.
I think he hated it because it was a 125 too, and Jimmy was an open rider, and why Kawasaki wanted to put him on that bike that year?
It was actually a 250.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was a 250, but yeah. And it had a 17-inch rear wheel. It was one of those bikes that they were changing every week, trying to get the maximum suspension out of it, and they were just trying radical things at all times. And so,
do you have also, Mark, if I'm not mistaken, do you have a Weinert an open bike?
Not a Weinert open bike. I have Galen Mosier's open bike.
Okay, from
it was the last twin shock that they ever made and they were already testing the Unitrack.
Mm-hmm.
And so Galen only raced this in the Golden State Series out in California. He never raced a national on it or whatever. But it's a handmade, heliarc welded frame, and the engine's actually based. It's a sandcast engine, but it's based off of the KDX 400, and it looks just like a KDX 400 engine, but it's a works engine with no serial numbers and sandcast.
Now, I would imagine finding parts for these bikes, like anything else, is is next to impossible. Tell me some miracle story. Tell me about a time where, you were looking for something that you'd never think you'd find and you'd happen to trip across it. Is there a story like that?
So yeah, so with my Howerton bike, when I got it, it didn't have a gas tank on it, and it didn't have the cylinder. And another collector, a very well-known collector, calls me up. And, with vintage or with works bikes, money doesn't really mean anything. I mean, there's a lot of trading and horse trading involved.
Yes.
And so he said, I need an OW125 works tank. And if you can get me that Yamaha tank, I will give you this Kent Howerton tank. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just call everybody I know and just put the feelers out, because you never know what you're going to find and when.
Right.
And after about 3 months, he calls me up and he goes, Mark, I'm going to sell you that tank and that cylinder I got. And I'm like, okay, why the change of heart or whatever? And he goes, I know you're trying, because every day I get a call. Somebody's looking for an OW125 tank. And then I have to explain to him that I'm the one looking for it and you're trying to help me out.
I see. So
he goes, so I know you're trying to get it. And so he ended up selling them to me for a really fair price.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I've heard in the past, and maybe even you told me the story where somebody needed a wheel or somebody needed a cylinder, and somebody traded it was something about somebody trading a set of works bike forks for something that just didn't relate to anything at all. It was like forks for a wheel or something unusual like that. Was that you who told me that?
Yeah, exactly. And so I buy up whenever I find works parts anywhere, or when I come across them, or somebody that's got them or whatever. I try and get them, and I just try and I try, just like when Steve called up and needed that engine. Well, I didn't have a bike to put that engine in, so I was happy to sell it to Steve. And I use those parts for trade bait.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, if a guy's got a pair of forks that I need, it doesn't matter how much money I have, because he needs another part, and he would rather trade that for a part than to actually have a pocket full of cash.
Mark, you told me something a long time ago, and you told me I can always make more money, but I'll never find that part again.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it.
I can't tell you how much money you've cost me over the years because of that. Hey, Mark, you know what I want to talk about for just a second, too, because I'm almost out of time. You and your wife have been animal activists for many, many years. I know she was very active with Budweiser, and you guys do so much with rescuing animals. Tell me about that, how you got involved, and what you guys still do with that organization.
So it's really all my wife. And she owns a little company called Bark, B-A-R-C.
Yes.
And she provides, she has a spay and neuter program in St. Louis for low-income families, people that can't afford to get their dogs spayed and neutered.
Right.
She runs a program that raises money to help them, and then they can get their animals spayed or neutered for a really super low price, and get the shots and get them in good shape for a really low price. And she's been doing that since probably the same time I was collecting works bikes.
Oh.
So about 2002, I'm guessing. And but yeah, no, she's been great, and they've spayed and neutered like 48,000 pets in St. Louis for and help low income families with that. So it's been really wonderful.
Now, wasn't she also doing something? Wasn't Anheuser-Busch very active in that? I thought I remember seeing something where she was handling some baby tigers at some point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, she's worked for Anheuser-Busch for almost 40 years. She's worked there 37 years. And at the time, she was actually working with St. Louis Animal Control. And it was a big thing back in the day for people to buy baby tigers and walk around and act like a cool guy with a baby tiger. But it's illegal to have, in St. Louis, it's illegal to have those. And so she was working with the animal control people in St. Louis, and they got 2 baby tigers they confiscated from a guy. This guy walked in with 2 baby tigers, holding 2 baby tigers into like a Midas muffler shop and was showing off. And so they confiscated those, and then they didn't want to put the tigers in with the sick cats and the sick dogs.
Sure.
And so we actually took them to our house, and we had them. I was the original Tiger King.
Mark, I mean, you were like the Tony Montana of Fenton. Well, you know, Mark,
yeah, but that's all my wife. I mean, she does wonderful things for animals, and she's done it for years and years and years. She doesn't make a dime of money out of it, but she raises hundreds of thousands of dollars to help people out.
Well, that is absolutely wonderful. Mark, I want to remind you, of course, to watch MX or Moto Fight Club coming up Tuesday. You know, we got to get the app, the MX Fight Club app, and we're all going to be tuning into that. You think you'll be watching?
I'll absolutely be watching.
All right. That sounds
And we
really...
better get that phone call so me and you can race next year.
Hey, you know what, Mark? We'll just go there on our own, you know?
I agree.
That's all.
Agree.
It won't be the first party. It won't be the first party we ever crashed, I'll tell you that.
That's for sure.
Hey, you give Lynn my regards. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Mark, and we'll be in touch, okay?
Very good, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Mark Hilderbrand from Nightmare Racing. I want to thank him again for taking the time to speak to us today here at Vintage Motocross Radio, which the show was today brought to you by Preston Petty Products. You go to PrestonPetty.com. They're on they're on Instagram. They have a website. Of course, you can always buy from me at Vintage Motocross Q&A. You can always see a special there on Wednesday nights. We have a Preston Petty special almost every night. Also, we've got some other great sponsors there. We have Vinco, Metro Racing, and of course, Amsoil. But for this Sunday afternoon, this beautiful Mother's Day, this is Joe Abadi. I want to thank you for tuning in to Vintage Motocross Radio. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Mark Hilderbrand. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll talk to you next Sunday.